This lecture will be covering the early Renaissance. These dates range from about circa 1400 to about 1500. As discussed in class, these dates are not hard, fast dates, but when we start to see the progression into the Renaissance. We're moving from the Middle Ages. This was the time period, roughly over 1,000 years, where life was dominated by the Catholic Church. The term the Middle Ages, interesting enough, actually was coined by the people in the Renaissance, because when they looked back at that time period, they thought nothing really important happened, and so they just lump it all together as the Middle Ages. What happens in the Renaissance, many of you have probably heard the Renaissance means rebirth. But rebirth of what? It was a rebirth of the ideals of the classical world, meaning ancient Greece and ancient Rome. When Rome fell, this was when the Middle Ages are seen to have begun. What happened at this time is many of the classic texts actually would have been lost if it wasn't for the Arabic world. In the world in the Middle East, many of these texts had been saved. Around the time of the Renaissance, this is when these texts were rediscovered by the Western world. During the Renaissance, we're going to see that these ideas influence all aspects of the arts, from painting, sculpture, and even architecture. The arts came to mean more than just craft or just beautiful objects. They became respected as a discipline to be studied. There was also a shift in the idea of the role of man. In the Middle Ages, life was just seen as a vale of tears that humans had to suffer through in order to get the true salvation of the afterlife. However, in the Renaissance, we're going to see the rise of humanism. Humanism is the focus on human potential and not just the focus on divine inspiration. Humanism believes that there is a goodness in all human beings, and all human beings have the potential for greatness. We're also going to see rises in science and technology at the time. Probably one of the most important inventions was Gutenberg's printing press in 1445. With the invention of the printing press, books could now be made much quicker and much cheaper than they previously had. Before this point, any books had to be handwritten. Usually this was done by monks. Therefore, most people who could read were involved with the church and were the aristocrats or the upper classes. Now, with the rise of the printing press, more people are being educated. We also see at this time the rise of the middle class, which comes from the merchant class. This is a time of trade and exploration, and we're seeing more people be able to come into a higher class because of this merchant trade. Again, it's a time of exploration and discovery. The Cape of Good Hope was rounded in 1497. Columbus discovers America in 1492, and in 1522, Magellan circumnavigated the globe. Also within the Renaissance, we have what's called the humanist spirit. Again, this is off the ideas of humanism, that there is worth and dignity in all human beings. That also followed the idea that the human, or man, was the measure of all things. This was widely influenced by Petrarch, a poet and Latin scholar, who we will talk about a little bit later. But he is considered the father of humanism. He believed that learning was the key to living a virtuous life, and that life itself should be an eternal quest for truth. If all humans would follow this, then the idea was the world would improve for all of humanity. Petrarch, along with Boccaccio, an author, were very instrumental in helping revive the works of ancient Greek and Roman authors, such as Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and Herodotus. One of the main tenets of humanism is that humans have free will. They are responsible for making their own choices. In general, humanists place the responsibility for human action squarely on humans and not on the divine. During this time, we also saw a rise in education. The Platonic Academy of Philosophy, which was located in Florence, the birthplace of the Renaissance. In fact, Florence called itself the New Athens. This academy was founded in 1462 by Cosimo de' Medici. It was a Neoplatonic school, which means it revived the ideas of Plato and many other ancient Greek philosophers. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at some of the artworks. This again starts about 1400 in Florence, Italy. Before this point, during the Middle Ages, sculpture had actually been the reigning artistic style. Much of this was because the sculptures were done as part of the Gothic cathedrals to help decorate the church. However, painting began to flourish with the development of more realistic tools such as oil paints, which we will talk about later in the lecture. In many of the paintings, you're also going to see that they are much more naturalistic, meaning they're trying to show the world as it actually was. An example of this is the painting that you see here. This is by Boccaccio. Boccaccio's dates 1401 to 1429. This work is actually a panel from the frescoes which are in the Bronici Chapel in Santa Maria della Carmine in Florence, Italy. This panel is what's called the tribute money, and it was created in 1425. Within this, we do see a biblical scene played out. This is part of the life cycle of St. Peter, and it describes a scene from the Gospel of Matthew in which Jesus directs Peter to find a coin in the mouth of a fish in order to pay the temple tax. Within this singular painting, we can see a continuous narration. There's actually three different things going on. In the center of the painting, you can see Jesus and the apostles standing around with the tax collector. The tax collector has the shorter tunic on. Here they're being told they need to pay a tax. Jesus then tells St. Peter to go over into the water, find the fish, and when he opens the fish's mouth, there's money in it. If you look to the left side of the painting, you can see this taking place. Finally, on the right side of the fresco, we can see St. Peter paying the temple tax. Within this painting, there are many interesting aspects, such as the men standing together. This is how you would naturally see a group of people standing together. If there are people in front, they block the people in back, so you can only see part of them. That is what you see here. In the Middle Ages, when you would have a group such as this, there was what was called stacking, meaning instead of showing people in a semicircle as they are here, they would almost be stacked on top of each other so the viewer could clearly see every individual. Boccaccio here is more concerned with realistically showing how these men would have been standing. You can also see in the clothing, the texture, the colors that are used, that these are much more realistic depictions. Also in the perspective, we have atmospheric perspective here. What is in the background of the work is supposed to be further away, meaning it's smaller and it's out of focus. On the right side of the work, we can also see the use of linear perspective to show that the building goes into the distance. Here, this is a very dramatic use of this perspective, and this is what we call foreshortening. Also, you can see the men are standing in what is called contrapposto. Contrapposto is a much more realistic stance. It's where the weight is shifted onto a single leg. This way it creates the body in tension. Half the body is relaxed, the other half is in tension holding the weight. This comic gives you an example of this. This is looking at typical ancient Egyptian figures. You can see how they are all shown with their legs together, very up and down and unlifelike. However, the central figure is claiming that he went to Greece and he got into contrapposto. And because of this, he looks much more natural. Another work by Boccaccio is the image you see here. Trinity with the Virgin, St. John the Evangelist, and donors, 1427. It is a fresco, and it is in the Santa Maria Novella, also in Florence, Italy. This is a large work, and in fact, what you see here, again, we see much of this realism within it, especially within the architecture. You can see here the use of perspective, so it looks behind the Christ figure and God. It looks as if we are actually looking into some sort of hallway or nave, when in fact, again, this is a flat work. We see the barrel vault with the coifred ceiling. This is reminiscent of ancient Roman works. And then you can also see the two different columns. The shorter columns, the capitals are Ionic, and then the taller outside columns have Corinthian capitals. Both of these are classic Greek architecture. Again, in the work, we see naturalistic clothing, and what's very interesting are the two people who appear to be kneeling. These were the donors. The donors mean they are the people who actually paid for the work, and they are presented realistically and they are presented in a life-size manner. This was done, these people are from the Lindsay family, and they are actually very active in the scene. We have seen donors in works before, but usually they'd be unrealistic or they'd be outside and not actually part of this. By this making them part of the scene, it makes them much more realistic, and their importance in the activity is also shown. At the bottom of the work, you can see the skeleton laying down. This is what's called a memento mori, and it is a reminder to all that death comes for all of us. The next work we're going to look at is by Piero della Francesca. His dates are circa 1406, between 1406 and 12, and then he died in 1492. He was very interested in portraiture, and just like in the works of Boccaccio, he was very concerned with showing things as they realistically were. In your textbook, we see the Battista Sofra and Federico de Montefello. These were portraits, they were husband and wife. They were painted 1472 to 73, and they are both oil on panel. And you can see Francesca paints them as he actually saw them. It is believed that the Countess had actually died in the same year, and so it's believed that her portrait might have been made from her death mask. We can see here with Montefeltro, he is shown from the profile. This was actually popular during the Renaissance because the idea was it showed the sitter's most distinctive features. Interesting enough, why we see his left profile is because Federico, who was the ruler of Umbria, a city that had began to compete with Florence, it's his left profile because he actually had lost his right eye and the bridge of his nose in a sword tournament. So this was his better side. However, you can see that Francesca painted him as he really was, and your book makes allusion that he painted him warts and all. You can also tell from this painting the importance that these two had. Not only because they have portraits, which again would not be cheap to do, but look at them compared to the landscape behind them. They are not part of this landscape, this background. They are above it. They are elevated, alluding to their station within society. The next work that we're going to look at is by Fran Angelica. His dates circa about 1400 to 1455. He was a Dominican monk, and what we are looking at here is what's called the Annunciation. This was a fresco from the monastery of San Marco, also within Florence. This was painted 1438 to 45, and again, it is a fresco. What is interesting about this work and the other ones within the monastery is that Frangelica actually painted all over the monastery. He painted in the rooms of the monks, in their meeting room, in the dining room, and this painting is actually located at the top of the stairs on the north side of the building. What is happening here is what's called the Annunciation. This is the moment where the angel Gabriel informs Mary of her pregnancy. What's very interesting here is when we look at this background, when we look at where this is taking place, it's actually taking place in San Marco. This is the cloister of San Marco, which is a cloister is an outside covered walkway. So Fran Angelica actually painted the event happening in the building in which the painting was. When we look at this, we can very clearly see again the columns with the Corinthian capitals going back to the Greek architecture, and then the arches that are used are influenced by the Roman architecture. What is interesting in this also is that it's not quite realistic. Why? Because look at the scale of the figures. Both the angel Gabriel and Mary are much, much larger than a normal human would be. So the scale of this is a bit off. Also, if you look to the left into the greenery, the flora and the fauna, here we can clearly see Fran Angelico has painted actual plants and flowers that were there at the time. However, he has spaced them out equally. That itself was a very medieval practice that he continued within the work. Now, other painters at the time were not very concerned with realism. One of these would be Sandro Botticelli. Here we see the very famous work, The Birth of Venus. This was painted circa 1486. It is a tempera on canvas and is located within the Uffizi within Florence, Italy. You can see with this work that Botticelli was not concerned with realistic representation within the work. You can see it with the very harsh outlines that are used. Outlines do not naturally occur in nature. And what he was more concerned with was he's painting with allegory, meaning that while we see this image, we see Venus, the moment Venus is born, if you will, because how Venus came about is she came about from the sea and the foam, and she just floated ashore on a shell, fully formed. And so what we see here with this very pagan idea, it's an allegory, meaning it stands, it represents for something else. The idea of this one is some people have actually linked Venus to Mary, possibly through the idea of uncorrupted love, or with the idea of Venus's birth just from the sea, with Jesus's birth through the Immaculate Conception. You can also see this example in Botticelli's La Primavera, or Spring. This was painted circa 1482, and it is also a tempera on panel within the Uffizi Museum in Florence. What happens in here is this painting is a celebration of spring. We can see to the right the zephyr, the west wind, coming in and taking away one of the figures, and then we see the woman in the flower dress, meant to represent spring. There is Cupid up above, we see muses, and we can see through the use of light. The light doesn't seem to be coming from any specific source. The heavy outlines, and even the flora and fauna that are represented, that again, Botticelli is not concerned with a realistic depiction. Instead, again, it's an allegory more celebrating the return of life as shown through spring. One of the major inventions for the Renaissance was the advent of oil paints. In the 15th century, Flemish painters developed what we know now as oil paints. What happens with these is that oil paints, you can now have a much bolder, brighter color. Before this time, the main painting use had been tempera, which is usually made with an egg-based solution. It was very thin and it dried very fast, so it was very hard to work with. Well, oil paints dried much, much slower. And because of this, different changes could be made, and the painter could actually blend colors on the canvas and could get into much finer detail within the work. Flemish painters used these oil paints to enhance the chiaroscuro, the light and the shade of the work. And it also was used to help develop that atmospheric perspective. The work that we are looking at here is by Robert Campin, and this is the Marode Altarpiece, 1425 to 1428. Interesting enough, he first painted this with egg and tempera, and then he painted over it, so it's also an oil paint on canvas. This is what is called a triptych, meaning it is actually 3 individual paintings that are then hooked together. The sides of the triptych can be folded closed, and usually on triptychs you also have some sort of painting on the outside. Here again, the scene that we are looking at is again the Annunciation, and that's what's in the center panel. This was actually the first time it was shown in a home and not some sort of holy place, whether it's a church or a monastery. To the left, in the left-hand panel, we see two figures standing outside with the door open looking in on the scene. These were actually the donors, again, the people who paid for the work, and they are watching the event take place. On the right panel, we actually see Joseph in his workroom. Joseph, again, was Mary's husband. As you examine the work, you can clearly see the use of perspective and the many fine details within the work, and also the bright, vivid colors that were used because of the oil paint. Now, this painting is full of religious symbolism. You can see a few examples of this. The lion finials on the bench, which are the figures on the top of the bench, they're symbols of watchfulness and of Jesus and his resurrection. On the opposite side of the same bench, we can see two dog finials. Dogs, when they are in paintings, usually represent fidelity and loyalty. There is a candle on the table. This represents the light of the world brought by Jesus. And then the flower itself is a lily. Lilies represent purity and are a symbol of Mary. Very interesting enough, in the middle scene, near the upper left, you can see a tiny little figure coming in through the side window. This is a little baby man, and he seems to be holding a cross. If you follow the line from where he's coming in and where he's going to land, looking at Mary's lap, there's a very bright spot. You have an implied line there, and it's showing that this is the pre-Jesus. So this is the Annunciation. It's the moment that Mary finds out she's pregnant, and we are about to witness this moment happen. Another famous artist at this time was Jan van Eyck, circa 1390 to 1441. Again, creating works with lots and lots of details. The image that you're looking at is the Arnolfini marriage, or it's other known as Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride. What happens here is that we are looking in on a scene. This is the moment where these two have just become married. And so we're actually witnessing a contract, if you will. Van Eyck has used very natural lighting within the work. If you pay attention, the light is coming from the window as it would if you were standing in the room with them. There's also various objects within the work that are in there to show the wealth of the subjects. We can look at their clothing. His clothing is obviously fur-lined. Her dress, very vivid, rich green, and you can see the detail and the textures within it to show of its opulence. She is not pregnant in this painting. This was actually the style of the time. Women would actually slump forward, and usually in the dresses such as this, there would be padding in the front to get this desired silhouette. We again see a dog in the painting. The dog represents loyalty and fidelity, especially when shown with a woman. And then the other objects in the work again allude to their wealth. The chandelier, the canopy bed. At first we want to think that we are in their bedroom. However, interesting enough, during the Renaissance, canopy beds were seen as the couch of estate, if you would. Basically, if you had money, you would show that you had a canopy bed, and these would often be put out into the living room. You can see in the window and just below the window's ledge that there are oranges. These represent trade and their wealth. It would not have been easy or cheap to get oranges at that time. What is interesting enough about this painting, though, is the double portrait. If you look on the back wall, there is a mirror. If you look closely within the mirror, we see the backs of Arnolfini and his bride. However, the artist is also actually reflected in the mirror, so we can see Van Eyck. This shows the changing role of the artist, that the artist was no longer just commissioned to do a work because of their talent and their skill, but they became an eyewitness to the event. Again, this was a marriage, so the artist is a witness to this event. What's also interesting is above the mirror on the wall, it looks like there was writing on the wall. And it is. This roughly translates into Jan van Eyck was here, the artist again making his presence known. The next image that we're going to look at is not from your textbook. This is by Hieronymus Bosch. His dates 1450 to 53 to 1516. What you're seeing here, your book has a different piece. The book has Haywain 1495 to 1500, an oil panel, also a triptych, but that is a triptych of the satires of evils of greed. What you're looking at here is the Garden of Earthly Delights. This also is a triptych. It dates from between 1490 and 1510, and it is an oil on oak. What is interesting about Bosch? Bosch was from Holland, and this was still an area that believed in witches. Astrology was taught in universities, and visions were considered to be the truth. And what we see within Bosch's work is this extraordinary imagination. We see very bizarre creatures, creatures that are part human, part animal. Bosch also, all of his works are done al prima, meaning without preliminary drawings. He just began to paint on the surface. What we see in these works are a very fantastical world. There's usually some sort of story going on, some sort of sequence of events, whether real or imaginary, much as we might see them in a dream. Bosch obviously is not concerned with reality in his works, but he's more concerned with their moralistic impact. And you see this in the Garden of Earthly Delights. This triptych is composed of a square middle panel flanked by two other oak rectangular wings that they close over the center as such as shutters. On the outside of this, on the outer wings, what we see is a grayscale painting, meaning it's all painted in different shades of gray, of the earth during the biblical narrative of the creation. However, once the triptych is open, the image that you see before you appears. What happens in this is the idea is that these three scenes are connected. However, that hasn't been 100% proved. Usually, the panels are read from left to right. On the left panel, the idea is that it's God presenting Eve to Adam. The central panel is a broad panorama of socially engaged nude figures, fantastical animals, and oversized fruit. On the right panel is considered a hellscape and portrays the torments of damnation. So we move from the Garden of Eden through sin to damnation. The work is made up of many, many, many tiny different little scenes. Again, Bosch is not worried about being realistic, but he's more worried about the moralistic message that the work portrays. Moving from painting to sculpture, again, sculpture centered in Florence. And like painting, it was concerned about the lifelikeness of the forms. It looked back to Greek and Roman forms. However, in Greek forms, we saw this idealized perfection, that when we looked upon an image in a sculpture, we wouldn't be able to recognize who the person was. It wouldn't be like, hey, that's LeBron James, but we would look at it as the ideal man. That changes within the Renaissance. Again, we are going to see man shown, but the goal was to show man as it actually would have been. During this time period, freestanding sculptures start to become popular again, and the focus on the human body, we're going to start seeing the newfound biological information become shown in the works. The first sculpture that you're looking here is on the right. These are called the Gates of Paradise, and they are by Lorenzo de Barbato. The Gates of Paradise, 1425 to 1452. Originally, these were the doors to the baptistry in Florence, and that's what is imaged on the left. A baptistry is a smaller building, usually next to a larger church, and it is a building where baptisms were performed. What you can see here, this is what's called a relief sculpture, meaning it's not freestanding. You can't walk around it and see it from all different angles. It is meant to be viewed from one side. Well, what you see here is each relief panel tells a story from the Old Testament and it is surrounded by important figures that the learned person would know who they were. Again, it is a continuous narration. The single work shows many different scenes, much like we saw in Boccaccio's The Tribute Money. On a personal note, I think it's very funny that these are the doors, the gates of paradise. However, as you can see, there is now a fence in front of them with very pointed edges, so we can no longer get through these gates of paradise. Probably the greatest sculptor of the time was Donatello. Donatello, 1386 to 1466, and here we can see two of his works. The one on the left is David, circa 1425-1430, and it is a bronze. This was the first freestanding nude sculpture that had been made since classical times. And what we see here is the very classical figure of David from the biblical tale. It symbolizes Christ's triumph over Satan. Here we see the moment both before and after David has slain Goliath. If you look, we can see that in the slingshot, the stone is still in the sling. So that's the moment before he has killed Goliath, yet it's also after victory. He has the sword in his hand from where he cut Goliath's head off, and he is standing on Goliath's head. Now, Donatello, if you look at this David, it's very different from Michelangelo's David, which we will look at in the next lecture. In this one, David looks very young. He's almost feminine. And the reason behind this is because Donatello, keeping with the early Renaissance ideal, is trying to show David as he actually would have been. The Bible describes David as a beautiful youth, and that's what Donatello is trying to show. Also, David is only wearing hat and boots in this. That's because, again, in the biblical tale, David cast off his armor because he thought it was too cumbersome for the battle. The other work that we see here is also by Donatello. This is Mary Magdalene, 1453 to 55, and it is wood and then wood that has been painted. What happens in this is, again, Donatello is trying to show Mary Magdalene as she would have been. In the biblical tales, Magdalene was a follower of Christ, was there for the crucifixion, and she is credited for finding the resurrection. Most stories portray her as a prostitute. And what happens is after the resurrection of Christ, she spent the rest of her life wandering in the desert, rejecting the life of the body. So what happens in this moment, this is supposed to be the moment where she has spent years in the desert. She's very thin. She is literally rough looking, if you will. And she's showing that moment where she's ready for the immortal life of the soul after spiritual resurrection. And again, Donatello is trying to show how she would have looked like if she really had wandered the desert for all these years. We do see changes in the early Renaissance architecture. Three of the main ways that the Renaissance architecture differed from the medieval architecture before it is that we're going to see the revival of classical models, again meaning classical Rome and classical Greek. We're going to see the application of non-structural details. In Gothic cathedrals, we had flying buttresses that were there for support. Well, now we're going to see those supports move away, but we're still going to have these decorative elements that are there. And then again, the outer expression of the buildings would change. Because of advances in technology, we no longer need the outside supporting structures. An example of this is going to be Filippino Brunelleschi's Florence Cathedral dome. All three of the images that you see here are of the Florence Cathedral. The bottom left is from the inside looking up in the dome, and then the other two, one's an aerial shot, and the next is a close-up. What happens within the architecture, is that Filippino Brunelleschi, who's considered the greatest architect of the time, his dates are 1377 to 1446. Well, what happened was the Florence Cathedral began being built in 1296. But for 80 years, the nave was just left open, meaning where the dome now is. Nobody could figure out how to close it without it collapsing in on itself. Nobody had done this with a dome that large. In fact, the diameter of the dome is 143 feet. So what happened, Filippino Brunelleschi actually went to Rome for inspiration. And he went to Rome and he looked at the Pantheon, which you can see imaged here. The Pantheon also has a large dome. You can see this in the left picture. In the background, you can see the dome. And then the picture on the right is actually taken from the inside. The light that is coming down is from the sun. This dome was not closed. However, Brunelleschi went here to get some inspiration for this. And what happened is the Pantheon, the temple, was created as a temple for all gods. It was first started under Marcus Agrippa in 27 BCE, and then it was rebuilt under Emperor Hadrian in 126 CE. In the ceiling, on the inside, you can see this honeycomb structure in the coifering. What this does is it actually helps change some of the weight. So you don't just have the force pushing down, you have it pushing it outwards, allowing for this large dome area to be created. So what happens is Brunelleschi goes there, looks at this, and gets inspired. So what he does with the Florence Cathedral, which you can again see here, is that he added these external ribs, which is the white, and then it was actually a dome within a dome. So you had a lighter dome and a heavier dome on the outside, and this helped disperse some of the weight. Also, if you pay attention, if you look at the pattern of the brickwork, it's done in a herringbone pattern. This, again, is done to help distribute the weight of the dome. So his inspiration actually came from the Roman model. Another architect of this time is Leon Battista Alberti, 1404 to 1472. He was both an architect and an author. He wrote many books on architecture. He believed that beauty was found in architecture from the harmony among all the many parts. And you can see this in the facade of the Church of St. Andrea in Mantua, which you're looking at here. This was designed by him in 1470. The reason why you say it was designed because he actually died before its completion. In this, you can see the Greek influence on the triangular pediment on the top, and we can also see the columns with their Corinthian capitals. The different arches are reminiscent of the Roman arch, and they are reminiscent of Roman triumphal arches with the large central arch. Here, it's all very well balanced. If we were to cut this work on the vertical axis and cut it and fold it in half, it would be exactly the same. And interesting enough, even adding to the balance, the height of it equals the width of it. Another famous architect at the time was Michelotte di Bartolomeo. Here what we're going to see is at this time families, the very wealthy families such as the Medicis, wanted fortress-like homes. Why? Because they wanted to show their wealth and their power. The example we're looking at here is the Palazzo Medici Riccardi. It was first built for Cosimo de' Medici, however it was later taken over by the Riccardi family. You can see on the outside very rough masonry. This was the same that was used in fortifications. You here also see very clear divisions of stories. It's neat and clear. They're different heights. The tallest is on the bottom, and each one goes up and it gets a little shorter. The windows themselves are very evenly spaced and shows the balance and the order through this. We also see the heavy cornice, which is the large overhang at the top, which almost seems to frame the building itself. And then if you look on the corner of the building on the second floor, you can actually see the Medici coat of arms is in the building. The other image that you see is that while this looks like a fortress on the outside, it's not on the inside. It is not a solid building, but the center is actually an open courtyard, and you can see that in this image. This was a private place for the family and other insiders. Next, we'll look at the literature of the time. Much of the literature was an imitation of the classics, and again, by classics, we are looking back to the ancient Greek and Roman works. Petrarch, who we already mentioned at the beginning, who is considered the father of humanism, was one of the most famous authors of this time. He lived from 1304 to 1372. His works reflected the philosophy of the ancient Greece and the new ideas of the Renaissance at the same time. He focused more on human achievement in his works rather than spirituality, which had been popular in the Middle Ages. He also strove to revive classical literature, and he didn't just want to absorb its elements into contemporary society, but to bring it back. Petrarch is most famous for his poetry. He actually fell in love with a woman named Laura. This was not her true identity. It's actually her real identity is never known, but he always seems to love her from a distance. In his Canzonori, he wrote 336 poems, different collections of sonnets, ballads, and songs. Most of these are about love, and the ones about Laura are the most famous. And this became a theme of Renaissance lyrical poetry. The expression of the speaker, meaning the writer's love for a woman, and his experience of both the joys and the pain that often accompany this love. What became interesting is the structure of this sonnet became one of the two patterns of sonnets that are most often used. The other is the Shakespearean sonnet, which we will look at in the next lecture. A sonnet is made of 14 lines, and the Petrarchian, or sometimes known as the Italian sonnet, the first 8 lines, or the octet, has a rhyme scheme, A, B, B, A, B, B, A, meaning the A's rhyme with each other, the B's rhyme with each other. Then the last 6 lines, or the sextet, can either rhyme or it can be free verse, meaning it doesn't have to rhyme at all. And then finally, we're going to briefly talk about music. Music during the early Renaissance, much like the other works, was worried about being more realistic. Music in the Middle Ages was mainly created just for the church. The church is still one of the largest patrons of music. However, we're going to start seeing music being commissioned by the elite, the wealthy, the aristocrats, if you will. And these were commissioned for special events or occasions. Who you see here is Guillaume Dufay, probably one of the people who shaped most of the music of the early Renaissance. And an example of how he shaped this was during the early Renaissance, what was known as parody mass became very popular. This was where a popular song of the time was inserted into a traditional mass. So you would be in mass and you would hear songs that you knew that were popular. Think of it as today, if you were in any sort of sermon and then all of a sudden some pop hit came on. All of a sudden you hear Katy Perry or Lady Gaga. However, these popular tunes were slowed down so they fit more within the mass, but people still knew and recognized what they were. Another development at this time was what's called the motet. And this was one movement compositions that set a sacred text to polyphonic, meaning many voices at the same time, choral music. Usually this was with no instrumental accompaniment. Also developed at this time is what's called word painting, meaning words were underscored and emphasized through music. Think of it as today's movies. When you watch a fight scene, what kind of music is going on? That is there to help add drama and emotion to the work. Finally, in the early Renaissance and the Renaissance, most people had some sort of musical training, both the educated and the uneducated masses. For those in the upper classes, it became a symbol of you being a Renaissance, well-rounded individual if you could play many instruments and sing. Also, the masses, many of the uneducated, also had musical talents and could play multiple instruments. And then music also became an important part of the social lives of both the aristocratic upper classes and of the masses. That concludes our lecture on the early Renaissance. We will pick up with the late Renaissance next time.